They stood in front of the chair like it was a border I wasn't allowed to cross. Not guards with weapons, worse. Sons with folded arms. Men who knew my habits, my silences, the way I used to step back without being asked. "You're not listed," Randall said, his voice flat, rehearsed. Trevor didn't look at me when he added, "It's for immediate family only." Immediate family. The words hit harder than the cold in the room. The attorney's office smelled like polished wood and old paper. Beige velvet carpet stretched beneath my feet, worn thin near the sideboard. There was a stain there, coffee, maybe like someone else had already spilled something and moved on. I stood at the doorway, holding a navy blue folder against my chest. Too tight. Like a shield. Like proof. Like something fragile. No one asked me to sit. The secretary behind the desk glanced up, then away. Her nameplate read K. Mendez. Young. Uncomfortable. She didn't make the rules. She just enforced them. "I received a letter," I said quietly. My voice sounded smaller than I expected. "From Winslow and Chambers. It had this address. This date." Randall scoffed. "They made a mistake." Trevor smiled the way he used to when explaining something I hadn't asked about. Patient. Condescending. "Mom will explain later. Let's just not do this here." "Do what? Exist?" I looked at the chair they were blocking. High-backed. Leather. Empty. I remembered sitting in that same position years ago in another room, another office, being told what was best for me. I remembered nodding then. Smiling. Signing. I didn't nod this time. "I'm not here to make a scene," I said. "I'm here because she wanted me here." "You're not on the list," the secretary repeated, apologetic but firm. I let the silence stretch. Long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. Then I stepped forward. Neither of my sons moved. I reached into the folder and removed a single document. White. Ordinary. Heavy in my hands. "Please give this to Mr. Harold," I said, placing it on the desk. "I believe it changes things." The secretary hesitated. Randall opened his mouth to protest, but Trevor touched his arm. "Let's wait," he murmured. The door at the far end of the room opened. A tall man with gray hair and tired eyes stepped inside. He held the paper now, flipping through it slowly. Carefully. Too carefully. Then he looked up at me. "Mrs. Delacroix," he said. "May I speak with you privately?" Something shifted. I felt it before I understood it. Behind me my sons straightened. In front of me the chair was still empty. But for the first time that morning, I knew it wouldn't stay that way. What was in that folder? And why did it make the attorney ignore the men who thought they were already in control? The hallway felt longer than it should have. Not because of distance, but because of what followed behind me. I could feel them. My sons. Their questions pressing into my back without being spoken. The attorney walked ahead. His shoes soft against the carpet. No rush. No hesitation. As if he already knew something the rest of us didn't. His office smelled like cedar and dust, old books, old decisions. There were no chairs. Just a high counter. Bare except for a lamp and a stack of files tied with twine. He laid the document flat between us. "This," he said carefully, "wasn't supposed to surface today." I didn't respond. I watched his fingers trace the page, slower now. Less certain. Outside the door I heard movement. A chair scraping. A voice lowering. Then silence again. The kind of silence that isn't calm. The kind that waits. "You brought originals," he said finally, glancing at the folder still tucked under my arm. "Yes. Not copies." "No." That earned me a look. Not suspicion. Recognition. He inhaled, then exhaled like a man choosing his next step wisely. "We'll proceed with the reading shortly," he said. "For now, you may return to the room." That was it. No explanation. No verdict. Just permission. When I stepped back inside, no one spoke. The chair, the one they guarded, was still there. Empty. I walked to it and sat down. Neither Randall nor Trevor stopped me. I rested the folder on my lap. Not like a shield this time. Like something settled. Something waiting. Across the table, a cousin I hadn't seen in decades met my eyes and gave the smallest nod. Not approval. Understanding. The attorney took his seat. The secretary adjusted her papers. And my sons wouldn't look at me. That hurt more than their words. I wondered when exactly it happened. When the woman who packed their lunches, paid their debts, waited up for their calls, became someone they needed to manage. The room grew quiet again. Too quiet. I thought of another room years ago, my kitchen filled with noise. Laughter bouncing off cabinets. Someone arguing over cereal. Someone slamming a door and coming back for a jacket 5 minutes later. That room didn't exist anymore. This one did. The attorney cleared his throat. Before we begin, he said, there has been a procedural adjustment. Randall stiffened. Trevor's jaw tightened. I didn't move. Outside, a car horn blared. Somewhere far away. Life continuing without permission. Inside, the air felt thick. Pressurized. Like the second before something breaks. The attorney shuffled his papers. And for the first time since my husband died, since I learned how quickly everything could be rearranged without asking me, I didn't feel small. I felt still. Centered. Like whatever came next, I would meet it standing. What procedural adjustment was enough to silence two confident men? And why did it feel like the beginning of something they hadn't planned for at all? The attorney began speaking, but his words blurred into a low hum. Not because they weren't important, because my mind had already traveled somewhere else. Somewhere quieter. Somewhere familiar. I sat there, hands folded over the folder, and thought about all the times I'd been invisible long before that room ever existed. Invisibility doesn't happen all at once. It happens slowly, gently, almost kindly. It begins the first time someone speaks for you instead of to you. The first time your opinion is replaced with a decision already made. The first time you're thanked for your patience instead of your effort. No one ever notices the moment a woman learns to disappear. They just grow used to the space she leaves behind. I remembered the kitchen table years earlier, papers spread across it, bills stacked neatly, my pen resting beside a mug gone cold. Randall pacing, confident, explaining numbers like I couldn't understand them. Trevor leaning against the counter, arms crossed, trusting his brother because it was easier than thinking too hard. Just sign here, Mom, Randall had said back then. For now. We'll fix it later. Later never came. Later rarely does. The attorney paused. Someone coughed. A chair creaked. I blinked and focused again. Across the table, Randall leaned back, one ankle resting over his knee. Relaxed. Controlled. He'd always believed control came from speaking the loudest. Trevor sat forward, elbows on the table, eyes darting between faces. He'd always believed control came from staying agreeable. Neither of them noticed the way my breathing had slowed. The way my shoulders no longer curved inward. They didn't notice because they never had. They hadn't noticed when I learned to sleep lightly, listening for the sound of keys in the door long after midnight. Hadn't noticed when I stopped buying myself new things so their emergencies could feel less heavy. Hadn't noticed when I smiled through exhaustion because it kept peace. People assume silence means consent. They confuse endurance with weakness. The attorney turned another page. The sound was sharp in the room. Is there an issue? Randall asked too quickly. The attorney didn't look at him. We're proceeding. That was all he said. Proceeding. The word echoed strangely in my chest. I wondered what they would say if they knew how many nights I'd spent staring at ceilings, calculating how to keep everyone afloat without capsizing myself. How many times I'd chosen quiet over conflict because conflict felt selfish. Love had taught me that. So had loss. I glanced at the door, the same one I'd followed the attorney through earlier. It looked ordinary now, harmless, but something about it felt like a threshold. Like once crossed, nothing returns to its previous shape. Trevor shifted in his seat, finally looking at me. Our eyes met for half a second before he looked away. In that moment I saw it. Not guilt. Not fear. Recognition. He was beginning to sense that something had moved. That the ground beneath him wasn't as solid as he'd believed. Randall didn't sense it yet. He was still smiling faintly. Still confident. Still certain the story would end the way it always had, with me stepping back. The attorney closed the folder in front of him. We'll continue shortly, he said. And just like that, the waiting returned. But it wasn't the same. Because this time, I wasn't waiting to be allowed in. What had shifted so quietly that even the people who knew me best hadn't seen it coming? And how long before they realized I wasn't stepping aside anymore? The pause stretched longer than anyone expected. It gave the room time to breathe and gave me time to remember. Not the dramatic moments. Not the arguments or the losses people talk about. The quiet ones. The ones that never make it into stories but shape them all the same. I thought about the years after my husband died. How the house learned a new sound, the absence of his footsteps. How grief didn't arrive like a wave but like fog, rolling in slowly until even ordinary things felt distant. I didn't collapse. I didn't fall apart. I did what needed doing. That's the danger of being capable. People assume you don't need care if you're strong enough to keep going. Randall had been 23 then, old enough to believe he knew how the world worked. Trevor barely 20, still half a boy, still looking for someone else to steer. I became the steady thing between them, the constant. I filled out paperwork with shaking hands and didn't let them see. Paid bills on time even when it meant skipping things I wanted. Answered questions I didn't have answers to with a calm voice that made everyone else feel safe. Safety is expensive. It costs you parts of yourself no one ever reimburses. Across the table, the attorney whispered something to the secretary. Papers were moved. Names underlined. The machinery of legality turning slowly, precisely. Randall leaned toward Trevor. "Relax," he murmured, low enough that he thought I wouldn't hear. "This is just formality." Formality. I nearly smiled. If only he knew how many times that word had been used to excuse things that were anything but. I remembered the first time Randall asked me for money. Not help, not advice, just money. He'd said it casually, like borrowing sugar from a neighbor. Promised it was temporary. Trevor had nodded along, trusting the confidence in his brother's voice. I hadn't hesitated then. Love didn't hesitate. But love also kept receipts, even when no one else did. The attorney cleared his throat again. "Before the reading begins," he said, "there's a matter that must be acknowledged on record." That got Randall's attention. His posture shifted. His smile tightened. Trevor's foot bounced under the table. I sat still. "Due to previously filed documentation," the attorney continued, "the structure of today's proceedings will differ slightly from what was anticipated." Anticipated by whom? The question hung unanswered. Randall opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. What documentation? The attorney finally looked at him. His gaze was level, neutral, unmoved. "We'll address that shortly." Shortly. Such a small word. Such a heavy promise. I felt something settle inside me. Not satisfaction, not triumph. Clarity. The kind that comes when you finally understand that caring everyone else has trained them to believe you exist for that purpose alone. I thought of all the times I'd stepped back to avoid discomfort. All the times I'd told myself this is just how family works. Maybe it was. But not anymore. Trevor glanced at me again. This time he didn't look away. There was something searching in his expression. A question he didn't yet know how to ask. I met his eyes calmly. I wasn't here to punish anyone. I was here because something I'd carried quietly for years had finally reached its limit. The attorney lifted the first page of the will. The paper made a soft sound as it turned. And in that sound, I felt the past and future brush against each other. Just briefly. Before separating forever. What was this previously filed documentation? And why did it feel like it was about to expose more than just legal details? Why did it feel personal? The attorney didn't begin reading right away. Instead, he set the papers down and looked around the room, as if making sure everyone understood where they were. Not just physically, but morally. "This will," he said, tapping the folder lightly, "has a history." Randall leaned forward now. "All wills do." "Yes," the attorney replied, calm as still water. "But not all histories are acknowledged." That was when I felt it, the subtle shift from confidence to calculation. Randall's jaw tightened. He wasn't listening anymore. He was measuring, searching for angles, for leverage. Trevor sat back, hands flat on the table. He looked like someone who had just realized he might have boarded the wrong train. The attorney continued, "Before proceeding, I need to confirm that all parties understand the nature of what's being read today." Randall nodded sharply. "We understand." "Do you?" I wondered. Because understanding isn't the same as assuming. I looked down at my hands. They were steady. That surprised me. I'd expected a tremor, a flutter, something to betray the years I'd spent swallowing words to keep peace. But peace had never been neutral. It had always asked more of me than anyone else. I thought of the nights I'd stayed awake, listening for the sound of my son's cars pulling in, of the checks I'd written without asking how they'd be repaid, of the way I'd learned to phrase my needs as suggestions so they wouldn't feel burdened. Somewhere along the way, silence had stopped being protection and started being permission. The attorney lifted his gaze. "Mrs. Delacroix," he said, "do you confirm your presence and participation in today's proceedings?" All eyes turned to me. Not with warmth, with curiosity. I nodded once. "I do." My voice didn't shake. Randall's brows drew together slightly. Flicker. Almost imperceptible. But I saw it. He hadn't expected me to speak first. The attorney acknowledged my response and turned back to the document. "Then we will proceed as required." He began reading. Names. Dates. Formal language that sounded distant but carried weight like iron. Randall relaxed again just a little. The familiar cadence lulled him. Legal language always had. Trevor didn't relax. His gaze kept flicking to me, as if trying to read something written beneath my expression. I gave him nothing, because this wasn't the moment for explanations. This was the moment for listening. As the attorney continued, I realized something quietly astonishing. I wasn't angry. Anger had burned itself out years ago in small private moments no one ever witnessed. What remained wasn't bitterness, it was resolve. I wasn't here to correct them. I was here to stop disappearing. The attorney paused mid-sentence. He adjusted his glasses. "And at this point," he said, "the proceedings diverge from what some of you may be expecting." Randall straightened fully now. "What does that mean?" The attorney looked down at the page, then up again. "It means," he said carefully, "that not all assumptions made leading up to today were accurate." The room went very still. Too still. I felt my heartbeat once. Strong. Certain. Whatever happened next would change the shape of everything that came after. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of that. What assumption were they about to lose? And why had I waited so long to let it fall apart on its own? The attorney cleared his throat again. It was a small sound. Ordinary. But in that room it landed like a dropped glass. "As I was saying," he continued, "the document before us reflects decisions made earlier than what some parties were led to believe." Randall's voice came sharper now. "Earlier than when?" The attorney didn't answer immediately. He turned a page. The sound of paper sliding against paper felt louder than it should have. I watched my sons carefully then, not as their mother, but as a woman finally seeing clearly. Randall's confidence had shifted into something brittle. Trevor's unease had deepened into something closer to dread. Neither of them looked at me. That told me everything. "This will," the attorney said, "is not the most recent expression of intent." Randall let out a short laugh. "That's impossible. We handled the revisions ourselves." Handled. Such an interesting word. I thought about all the times decisions had been handled for me. When outcomes were presented as favors. When my consent was assumed because my resistance had been worn down gently over time. The attorney raised his eyes. "What you handled," he said evenly, "was a revision. What governs today is something else entirely." Trevor swallowed. "Something else?" "Yes." The attorney placed his hand flat on the document. "A binding agreement executed years earlier. Properly witnessed. Properly notarized. Properly filed." The room didn't move. No one breathed. Randall stood up abruptly. "You're saying there's another will?" The attorney shook his head once. "No. I'm saying there was an agreement. One that predates and supersedes what you submitted." Randall's face drained of color. "That's not possible. We would have known." The attorney looked at him for a long moment. "Not all agreements are made with everyone present." That was when Trevor finally turned toward me. Really looked. Not as someone waiting for reassurance, but as someone beginning to understand the cost of not paying attention. My gaze stayed forward. I didn't offer clarity. I didn't offer comfort. Because the truth, when it comes, should stand on its own. The attorney continued, voice steady. "This agreement establishes a sole beneficiary arrangement based on mutual consent at the time of signing. Randall shook his head slowly. With who? The attorney didn't answer him. Instead, he looked directly at me. Mrs. Delacroix, he said, do you confirm your involvement in the execution of this agreement? I felt every eye in the room turn. This was the moment I'd imagined in fragments, in half-formed thoughts at 3 in the morning, in the quiet after difficult phone calls, in the space between what I'd given and what I'd kept. Yes, I said. I do. My voice didn't rise. It didn't tremble. It landed. Randall stared at me now, disbelief cracking through his expression. Mom, what is this? I met his gaze calmly. Something that was decided, I said. Long before you thought decisions were yours to make. The attorney nodded once and returned his attention to the document. We will now proceed, he said, with the reading as it applies under this agreement. The room felt different now. Heavier. Sharper. Like a door had opened somewhere behind the walls, letting in air no one had prepared for. Who was the agreement truly between? And what truth had been waiting all these years for the right moment to be heard? The attorney didn't raise his voice when he said the name. He didn't need to. Marlene Delacroix. The room reacted before anyone spoke. Randall froze like the word had struck him physically. Trevor inhaled sharply like he'd forgotten how. Marlene. My sister. The woman who laughed too loudly, wore perfume even when she stayed home, and never pretended not to see what others chose to ignore. The agreement, the attorney continued, was a mutual will executed in 2008 between Marlene Delacroix and May Delacroix. He let that settle. It named each other as sole beneficiaries. In the event of one party's passing, the surviving party inherits the entire estate, without exception, unless revoked jointly. Randall's voice came out thin. That can't be right. She was sick. She was not at the time of signing, the attorney replied calmly. And there is no record of revocation. None. Trevor turned fully toward me now. His eyes searched my face like a child realizing a story he thought he knew had an ending he'd never heard. You and Aunt Marlene, he whispered. You planned this. I nodded once. Not defensively. Not triumphantly. Truth doesn't need decoration. She asked, I said. Because she knew people change when money enters the room. Randall laughed, sharp and disbelieving. So this was a trick? A setup? No, I said quietly. It was trust. That stopped him. Because trust was the one thing he hadn't calculated. I looked at both of my sons then, really looked. Not at the men they'd become, but at the boys they once were. The ones who ran to Marlene when she arrived, who stayed up late eating candy she shouldn't have given them, who once believed love meant presence. She knew, I continued, that when she was gone, people would come asking what they were owed. She wanted to make sure her life didn't end as a transaction. The attorney resumed. Under this agreement, Mrs. Delacroix, he nodded toward me, is the sole legal beneficiary of Marlene's entire estate. Silence crashed down. Not awkward silence. Final silence. Randall sat slowly, as if his legs had forgotten their purpose. His confidence had nowhere left to stand. Trevor lowered his head, hands pressed together. Not angry, not relieved, ashamed. I felt no victory, only a deep, steady ache, and beneath it peace. Because the opening hook, the chair, the blocked path, the audacity of being told I didn't belong finally made sense. They weren't guarding the estate. They were guarding their assumptions. The attorney closed the folder. This concludes the reading, he said. As people stood, whispered, gathered coats, I remained seated for a moment longer. I thought of Marlene's voice years ago saying lightly, "Promise me you won't let them erase you." I had promised, and today, kept it. What happens after the truth is spoken? When power shifts, relationships fracture, and a woman must decide not just what she inherits, but who she becomes next. The room emptied slowly, not with chaos, with avoidance. People gathered papers they didn't need, adjusted coats that didn't require fixing, whispered half-sentences meant for no one in particular. No one congratulated me. No one apologized either. Truth has a way of rearranging people without asking them to speak. Randall was the first to leave. He didn't look at me, not once. Not when he stood. Not when he walked past the chair he'd blocked earlier like it offended him now. He moved quickly, like a man late for something he no longer knew how to reach. Trevor lingered. He stood near the door, hands shoved deep into his pockets, shoulders rounded the way they used to be when he was young and unsure whether he was in trouble. "Mom," he said quietly. I looked at him. Really looked. Not the man who had stood behind his brother. Not the son who had stayed silent when silence was convenient. But the child who once waited by the window for me to come home, counting cars, convinced every red taillight might be mine. "I didn't know," he said. "About the agreement. About any of it." "I know," I replied. That surprised him. He swallowed. "I should have asked more questions." "Yes," I said gently. "You should have." He nodded. Not in defense. In acceptance. "I'm sorry," he said. "Not for today. For before." I let that settle. "I'm not angry," I told him. "But I won't pretend nothing changed. I wouldn't ask you to. That mattered." He left then, quietly, respectfully, like someone who finally understood the weight of a door closing. I stayed until the last chair was pushed in. Then I walked out alone. The afternoon light felt different on my skin. Warmer. Like it wasn't rushing past me anymore. Like it was willing to wait. At home, the house greeted me with its familiar hush. Not loneliness. Just space. I hung up my coat, set my keys down, ran my hand along the back of the couch Derek built years ago. The wood smoothed by time and memory. I made tea. Not because I needed it, but because some rituals don't ask why. As the kettle warmed, I thought about all the years I'd mistaken being needed for being valued. How easily love can be confused with obligation when you're the one always giving. Marlene used to say, "People don't take advantage of kindness. They take advantage of silence." She was right. That night, I took out the navy folder again, not to protect myself, not to prepare, but to put it away. Job was done. In the drawer beneath it, I placed something else. A photograph. 2 women standing outside a county office years ago. Arms linked, laughing like they'd just gotten away with something. Because in a way we had. Not money. Not power. But certainty. The certainty that when the world tried to shrink us, we'd left proof of who we were. I slept deeply that night. No rehearsing conversations. No bracing for calls. Just rest. In the weeks that followed, life didn't become perfect, but it became honest. Randall stopped calling. Trevor called sometimes, awkwardly, carefully. We spoke about weather, work, ordinary things. Trust didn't return overnight, but it didn't vanish either. And me? I started doing small things without explaining myself. Saying no without apology. Taking up space without guilt. Speaking when silence no longer served me. I donated part of Marlene's estate to the places she loved. The library, the shelter, the quiet corners where people are seen without being measured. And the rest? I lived. Fully. Deliberately. Because the real inheritance wasn't money. It was this. The right to sit in any chair I choose. The right to be present without permission. The right to refuse erasure quietly, firmly, completely. If there's a moral here, it isn't about wills or money or betrayal. It's this. You don't owe your silence to anyone. Not to family. Not to tradition. Not to peace that costs you yourself. And if you've spent years being underestimated because you were kind, patient, forgiving, remember this. People mistake quiet women for empty spaces. Until one day they discover. The silence was never absence. It was restraint. And when restraint ends, truth finally gets a seat at the table. If this story stayed with you, if you recognized yourself in the pauses, the giving, the moment of finally standing your ground, then you're not alone. Share this with someone who needs permission to stop shrinking. And if you believe stories like this matter, let your presence be known. Because sometimes, the bravest thing a person can do is simply refuse to disappear.